Hey guys, today we will be diving deep into the Marvel API and creating an awesome app. This app provides an interface for the users to search Marvel characters. It includes a search box and a submit button. When the users type in the search box, the code will use the Marvel API to query the characters that match the search criteria. If the number of characters that match the search criteria is greater than 0, the code will display the name and image of the character that first appears in the search criteria. If the number of characters that match the search criteria is 0, the code will display a message saying that no results were found. The app also provides a drop down list of characters that match the search criteria as the user types. The asterisk selector targets all the elements and sets their padding and margin to 0 to remove any default margin added by the browser. We set the box sizing to border box, which tells the browser to include an element's border and padding in its total width and height. Next, we create the app layout using HTML. We start by creating a div with class container, which wraps all the page content. Inside container, we have an input container that further wraps an input element and a button element. We set the default value of input element to Iron Man. Now, we create a div with class list that is initially empty and will later display search autocomplete suggestions. Similarly, we have an empty display container that will later display the search result. Let us style the app using CSS. We start by setting the background color of the body to dark red color. For the container, we use dark gray color as the background and set the width to 90% of its parent element with maximum width of 500 px. We also add a padding of 3 m on the top and bottom and a padding of 2 m on the sides. And we also set the border radius to 1 m to give it rounded corners. The position absolute rule positions the container element absolutely relative to its closest positioned ancestor element. Lastly, we center the container horizontally and add some spacing on its top. For the input container, we set the display to grid. The grid template columns 9FR and 3FR rule sets the grid columns to 9 parts and 3 parts respectively. The gap of 1 m rule sets the gap of 1 m between the grid items. Next, we set the padding for input to 1 m and 0.5 m. Here, 1 m is equivalent to the font size of the element's parent. Next, we target the button element and add a similar styling to it. Now, we target an element with class name display container and set the padding to 1 m. As mentioned before, 1 m is equivalent to font size of the element's parent. Next, we go to the JavaScript code. We begin by initializing some reference variables. The first two lines, we have selected the input element and the button element. Now, we create a new date object with the current date and time. The getTime method returns the number of milliseconds elapsed since January 1, 1970. We console log this value. We used restructuring assign to assign values from API key and hash value. The array contains three elements: the string, ts, variable representing an API key, and a variable representing the hash value. By destructuring assignment, the first element in the array is assigned to the timestamp variable, the second element to the API key variable, and the third element is assigned to the hash value variable. Here we have three different variables. Let us assign the value of timestamp to the first variable. For example, your public key is the following, the private key is the following. So, by this example, we can obtain hash value by going to MD5 hash generator and combining the three strings in the order timestamp, private key, and public key. We then copy the MD5 hash value variable. Remember, this is only an example. In real life, you would have to go to Marvel API website and generate API key by clicking on get a key. Next, we add a click event listener to the button. When the user clicks on the button, it first validates the input. If the input is empty, it alerts the user that the input cannot be empty. Let's copy the URL from the interactive documentation and paste it as the value of constant URL. Next, we also add the public API key value, hash key value, and timestamp value in the URL. Lastly, we also add name, which is the value of input element to the URL. Remember, all these values are just for example, and in real life you would have to go to the Marvel API website to generate the true values. Now I'm closing all the tabs so that the original values are not revealed. This is to prevent any unauthorized access or misuse. This code sends a GET request to the URL specified in the URL variable using the fetch function and then waits for the response to come back. The await keyword is used to wait for the fetch function to return a response object. Once the response is received, the JSON method is used to parse the response body as JSON data and the result is stored in JSON data variable. If no results are found, we display so in the card container. Else, we display the details for the JSON data in the HTML of the card container. Next, we display the default, that is Iron Man superhero on load. As you can see in the result, the superhero image is super huge and completely out of place. Hence, we use CSS to put the image back into its original place and into its original size. Next, we make the container for image and the image circular by adding a border radius of 50% to each of them. We also set a fixed height and width to the for the character description, we set the line height to 2 em to make the text more readable. Also, we set the font size to 300 to give the text a delicate appearance. I realized even after styling, the image and the text weren't properly aligned. The reason for this was I mistakenly placed the list and display container inside the input container. Next is a function that generates autocomplete suggestions for each input letter after the length of 3. This function is called every time a key up event takes place. This function firstly calls the remove elements function. The remove element function clears all the divs for such autocomplete suggestions. Next, if the input length is less than 4, we skip auto suggestions. This is done to save some API calls. Then we make an API call and get back all the possible names in the result. Again, we create a constant URL and copy the previous URL. But this time, instead of name, the endpoint would be name starts with. Then we make an API call and get back all the possible names in the result. We display each name in the divs, which when we click calls the display words function to display the clicked word in the input. Also, we display the matched word in bold. Lastly, the display words displays the selected word in the input box. Here you can see suggestions. However, these suggestions have not been styled and hence do not appear properly in the UI. The list element defines the styles for parent container element of the autocomplete list. It sets the position to absolute, which allows it to be positioned anywhere on the page relative to its nearest position ancestor element. It also sets the width to 64%, which determines the width of the list container. It sets the background to 555, that is a dark gray color, and the text color to white. It also sets the Z index to 1, which determines the stacking order of positioned element. Autocomplete items defines the styles for each element in the autocomplete list. It sets the padding to 0.5 m, which adds spacing around each item. You can finally see the app in working.